The spring of 1975 settled over Aldridge, Kansas, with blooming tulips and the hum of small-town routine. On Willow Creek Lane, the Hartwell estate stood as a symbol of quiet dignity, home to Dr. Silas Hartwell, a respected psychiatrist, and his two daughters, Eleanor and Clara. The town spoke kindly of him, a devoted father, still grieving his wife's tragic death. But behind the shuttered windows and locked garden gates, something unspeakable was unfolding. What the town saw as discipline was, in truth, domination. Silas wasn't raising his daughters. He was reshaping them, guiding them into roles no child should ever understand. Roles not as daughters, but as brides in spirit, bound by rituals, veils, and vows. No one outside those walls will never witnessed. Before we dive into the story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the darkest tales hidden in plain sight. And after you've subscribed, write in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Together we are building a community of night watchers who face these chilling stories side by side, no matter the distance. Now, let's continue with the story. Dr. Silas Hartwell had arrived 6 months earlier. A soft-spoken man with silver temples and a polished manner, he moved into the Victorian mansion on Willow Creek Lane with his two daughters after the tragic passing of his wife. The story went that she had slipped on ice and struck her head in a freak accident. People mourned for Silas, praised his composure, and applauded his decision to raise Eleanor and Clara alone. The townsfolk didn't see much of the girls. Eleanor was 17, studious, graceful, always dressed in long skirts even during summer. Clara, 15, was more spirited, with strawberry blonde curls and wary eyes. They didn't attend school, but Silas assured everyone he was homeschooling them using advanced psychological curricula from his practice. That explanation satisfied Aldridge, and no one asked further. The Hartwell estate was one of the oldest properties in Aldridge. It sat on the edge of town, surrounded by trees that blocked the view from the road. The wrought iron gate, once ornamental, now looked like a barrier. Few ever stepped past it. Delivery men were told to leave packages by the mailbox. Even the mail carrier avoided lingering. Inside, the house had changed. Silas converted the former parlor into a meditation hall, its windows permanently covered with blackout curtains. A heavy scent of beeswax and lavender clung to the halls. He kept a strict schedule for the girls. They rose at 6, dressed in modest clothes, and spent their mornings in what Silas called scripture study, though it involved no Bible. Instead, the texts were handwritten manuscripts Silas had penned himself, filled with phrases about obedience, purification, and the sacred bond between father and daughters. At town events, Silas would attend alone. He brought pies to the church bake sale, nodded politely at barbershop meetings, and once offered to host a grief support group for widowers. But when asked how the girls were adjusting, he would only smile. "They're blossoming," he said, "becoming exactly what their mother would have wanted." But no one knew what that meant. No one saw the calendar in Eleanor's room, where dates were marked not with events but with phrases like ritual preparation and reflection day. No one saw Clara's journals, filled with looping cursive and disturbing sketches of eyes watching from behind lace curtains. They were isolated by design, taught to believe that the outside world was unclean, dangerous, corrupt. And slowly, without the town's notice, Silas Hartwell was not just raising daughters. He was shaping something far more unnatural. The people of Aldridge would not learn the truth until decades later. But by then, the story of the Hartwell sisters was no longer about family. It was about control, devotion, and a horrifying redefinition of love. Chapter 2. Rules of the House. Each morning began the same way inside the Hartwell estate. Before the sun even warmed the lace curtains in their upstairs bedrooms, Eleanor and Clara were already on their knees at the edge of the dining table, pale candlelight flickering on the brass chandelier above. Silas had left the day's devotionals on fine parchment paper, folded precisely, waiting in a silver dish. The girls opened them in silence. These weren't scriptures from any church. They were manifestos. Each devotional began with a title like Sanctified Obedience or The Hearth is Temple. They were written in looping cursive with a fountain pen, the ink always the same shade of blue. The girls were instructed to copy each one by hand into their matching leather journals, then recite a chosen phrase out loud 3 times before breakfast. There was no deviation, no questions. Silas Hartwell had constructed an entire theology centered around 3 roles: the Father, the Daughter, and the Spirit. He called it the Sacred Trinity. He taught that their mother, Margaret, had been a divine vessel, pure and chosen, and that her essence had not perished when her body did. According to Silas, Margaret's spirit had divided upon her death and flowed into their daughters, 1/2 into Eleanor, 1/2 into Clara. "You are no longer just my children," he would say in his calm, clinical voice. "You are her continuation. You are my eternal brides." The word brides was never shouted. It didn't have to be. It was spoken with soft reverence, as if Silas believed he was honoring a spiritual contract beyond earthly comprehension. The house became a chapel. Meals were eaten in ritual silence. Every corner was cleaned weekly with scented oil, part of a process he called spiritual housekeeping. Even the floors were polished, not for hygiene, but to reflect purity back into the home. At first, Eleanor accepted it. She had always been obedient. After their mother died, she clung to any structure that made sense. Clara, however, was different. She was younger, more impulsive, and far less willing to believe that her father's teachings were sacred. She started to resist. It began with subtle defiance. She would recite a line incorrectly, skip the morning kneeling, or close her bedroom door at night, something forbidden by Rule 37. Silas didn't scream. He didn't hit. He simply withdrew affection. Clara would wake up to no breakfast. Her devotional would be missing. At dinner, he would speak only to Eleanor. "The spirit recoils when touched by rebellion," he once said softly while pouring Eleanor's tea. "We must not shame the Trinity." The punishments evolved. Clara was locked in the windowless laundry room for hours, told to fast and reflect on the blessings of her body. When she returned, gaunt and pale, Silas placed a white veil over her head and told her she had been cleansed. "You are ready to carry the light again," he whispered. Eleanor began to speak like him, repeat his mantras. She once told Clara, "He's saving us from the filth of the world." But in her eyes, Clara saw the flicker of doubt, or maybe fear, maybe both. The rules became impossible to follow. By the end of the summer, there were over 100 of them, all numbered, all memorized. They covered everything: what to wear, how to breathe during prayer, when to smile, how to sit, even how long to make eye contact with their father. Every transgression was a betrayal of the Trinity. The Hartwell house was no longer a home. It was a shrine to a twisted belief system that cloaked abuse in the language of destiny. And the girls, once daughters, were being reshaped into something else entirely. Something sacred, he said. Something holy. something terrifying. Chapter 3. The Ceremony. The basement had always been off-limits, a cold, concrete underbelly beneath the ornate house above. But on the evening of Eleanor's 18th birthday, Silas unlocked the cellar door with an old iron key and led the girls down by candlelight. The staircase creaked beneath their bare feet. At the bottom, the air was thick with beeswax and rosewater. Dozens of candles flickered on iron stands. Their shadows danced across the stone walls, casting silhouettes of shapes that looked almost like crosses, but not quite. In the center of the room was a large circle drawn in white chalk, surrounded by dried lavender and rosemary. The girls wore gowns, long ivory dresses Silas had sewn by hand, identical to their mother's wedding dress. Eleanor's was cinched at the waist with a silk ribbon. Clara's had lace along the cuffs. They hadn't been allowed to speak all day. Silence, Silas said, was necessary for purification. He instructed Clara to stand near the far wall and pick up the violin. She had been practicing one song for weeks, Schubert's Ave Maria. Her fingers trembled as she placed the bow to the strings. Silas led Eleanor into the chalk circle. She moved slowly, not out of reverence, but uncertainty. She looked down at the floor, avoiding his gaze, her cheeks pale beneath the soft candlelight. Her hair had been brushed smooth and left loose over her shoulders, just like the old photograph of their mother that hung in the upstairs hallway. Silas began to speak. He called it a bonding ceremony, a sacred ritual marking the transition from girlhood to eternal devotion. His words were soft, loving, rehearsed. He spoke of unity, of divine connection, of the spirit of Margaret, their mother, dwelling now fully in Eleanor. He reached into a wooden box and lifted a thin gold ring. Then, with the steadiness of a man who had planned this for years, he placed the ring on Eleanor's left hand and gently draped their mother's wedding veil over her head. She flinched at his touch, but did not speak. She had been trained not to. Her lips quivered as she lowered her eyes. Clara played Ave Maria, her fingers slipping on the strings as tears welled in her eyes. The notes wavered and cracked. Silas didn't react. He kept reciting. "For thou art the vessel reborn," he whispered to Eleanor, "and I, your eternal keeper." In spirit, in love, in union. The words sounded like wedding vows. They were wedding vows. When it ended, Eleanor was told to kneel. Silas placed his hands on her head and whispered something inaudible to Clara, who stood in the corner frozen, the violin hanging limp at her side. Then he blew out each candle, one by one, until they were in complete darkness. Later that night, Eleanor wrote in her journal, "He says I am now complete, but I feel like something has been taken from me, like I don't belong to myself anymore." She tucked the journal under her pillow before falling asleep, still wearing the ring. Outside, the night was quiet, but inside the Hartwell house, something sacred had been violated, and Clara, still clutching her violin, began to realize that this wasn't a family anymore. It was a ceremony that never ended, a ritual with no escape. Chapter 4. Letters that never reached. Eleanor had always been the better writer. Her sentences were neat, almost lyrical, and her tone carried the forced calm of someone trying to believe what they were saying. Clara, on the other hand, wrote like someone trying to scream through paper. The letters began as a secret project, one Clara initiated during an early morning chore, finding an unused typewriter in the attic beneath an old sheet. They decided to write to their grandmother, Margaret's mother, who lived alone in Ohio. They had not seen her since their mother's funeral. Silas never spoke of her, and strictly forbade contact with external influences. But both girls remembered the warmth of her voice and the way she once kissed their cheeks and tucked them in with lullabies. She had felt like safety. Eleanor's first letter was gentle. "Dear Grandma, we are well. Father has taken great care of us. Our studies are rigorous but rewarding. The house is quiet now, but full of purpose. We miss you. I miss you. Please write back soon." She ended it with a smiley face drawn in the corner, something childlike and sad. Clara's letter, written the same day, was very different. "Grandma, please come get us. Something is wrong here. Father says we are vessels. He says I'm being disobedient. Eleanor is changing. She wears Mom's veil and says we're chosen. I don't want to be chosen. I just want to go home. Clara." They folded the letters carefully and hid them beneath Clara's skirt. Every few weeks, when allowed into town for errands, they slipped them through a loose floorboard at the Aldridge post office. The man behind the counter, Mr. Lyle Jennings, had worked there for 30 years. He was quiet, but observant. He noticed how the girls never spoke freely, how their eyes rarely met his. One day, Clara dropped her scarf. When he picked it up and handed it back, she whispered, "Please make sure they reach her," then turned quickly and walked away. Lyle began mailing the letters himself. He never spoke of it, but he started keeping copies. Something about the wording chilled him. The way they spoke of ritual cleansing and sacred obedience. He began writing his own notes, logging the dates and times they visited, recording how often Eleanor's voice seemed hollow and Clara's smile seemed broken. Then, in the autumn of that same year, Lyle Jennings died in a single-car crash off Route 19. His vehicle had veered off a dry, straight road in broad daylight. Locals called it a tragedy. But a few years later, when the Hartwell case reopened, some began to wonder whether Lyle's death had truly been accidental. After his passing, the letters stopped reaching Ohio. Their grandmother never received a single one. The floorboard at the post office was nailed down during renovations. The girls were cut off once more. Eleanor's journal from that winter took on a new tone. She wrote about the silence as comforting, about Silas's hands as healing. Her entries read like scripture, detached from reality. Clara's, by contrast, were frantic. Her handwriting grew larger, more erratic. She scratched words deep into the paper. Trapped. Pretend. One entry simply read, "If no one finds us, does that mean we were never real?" The house, the rituals, the rules, they were no longer just routines. They were becoming reality. And the girls, once witnesses to something disturbing, were now slowly being consumed by it. Chapter 5. The Third Ring. Clara turned 17 in the spring of 1977. The tulips bloomed again in Aldridge, but the Hartwell estate remained frozen in time, sealed in a world of veils, rules, and whispered scripture. Silas had begun referring to Clara as the second vessel. He said the Trinity was incomplete, that Eleanor's union had only been the beginning. Now it was Clara's time to be crowned. But Clara was not Eleanor. She had learned how to pretend, how to bow her head, recite her devotionals, and repeat his phrases with vacant eyes. But inside, she was building a wall, stacking pieces of herself behind it, memories of her mother, of freedom, of music that didn't echo through rituals. Still, Silas pressed forward. He began preparing her with small rituals, cleansing fasts, nights of solitude, reflection sessions in a locked upstairs room known as the prayer chamber. It had once been a guest room. Silas had stripped it bare, lined it with mirrors, and installed a small reel-to-reel recorder that played his voice on a loop. You are sacred. You are chosen. The flesh must be bound to the spirit. She spent hours locked inside, forced to listen to the sound of his voice repeating those lines over and over. At first, she screamed. Then, she cried. Eventually, she said nothing at all. Eleanor, now fully indoctrinated, brought her meals through the door. Clear broth and a single piece of bread on a silver tray. She would whisper, "It's better if you just listen." It gets easier, but Clara never believed that. She saw the hollowness in Eleanor's eyes. She knew what easier had cost her. On the night of Clara's 17th birthday, the ritual was prepared again. The basement was lit with candles. The white chalk circle had been redrawn. The gold ring, nearly identical to Eleanor's, rested in the same wooden box. Clara stood at the top of the stairs, pale in her white dress, eyes glazed. Eleanor waited below, holding their mother's veil. Silas beckoned. "Step forward, Clara." Let the spirit enter fully. Clara didn't move. Eleanor approached, voice trembling. "We have to do this. It's for the Trinity." But Clara's body tensed. Something inside her cracked open. A scream rose in her chest, but she swallowed it. Instead, she stepped down, one foot after another, heart pounding in her ears. She allowed Eleanor to place the veil on her head. She let Silas take her hand. But as he lifted the ring, Clara's eyes darted toward the back door, the one that led to the storm cellar, and beyond that, the woods. She waited. She endured. And then, at the moment Silas began his vows, she ran. The veil flew from her head. Her bare feet slapped against the cold floor, then the wet grass outside. She didn't look back. She darted through the overgrown garden, past the broken statue of St. Agnes, and into the trees. She ran until the branches clawed at her arms and mud soaked her dress. The darkness welcomed her. She ran until she collapsed. The next morning, Eleanor found her. She was curled in a circle of daffodils that had bloomed wild beyond the orchard, her dress torn, her lips cracked. The gold ring was clutched in her fist, bent out of shape. She looked up at her sister and said, "If I go back, I won't come out again." Eleanor didn't speak. She helped Clara to her feet and led her home in silence. The ceremony was never finished, but the ring remained, and the Trinity, Silas said later that night, would not be denied. Chapter 6. The Therapist's Notes. By the summer of 1978, rumors had begun to stir again in Aldridge. The Hartwell girls had not been seen at the market in months. When Silas did come into town, he came alone, wearing his usual tweed jacket and distant smile. He said the girls were under spiritual retreat, immersed in intensive study and self-reflection. No one questioned it. At least, not out loud. But one woman did. Janet Holloway had only been with the Kansas State Education Department for 6 months. She was young, idealistic, and recently certified as a child development specialist. Her assignment was simple: conduct routine welfare checks on registered homeschooling families across the state. The Hartwells were flagged for review due to their lack of recent documentation. Janet arrived at the estate on a Thursday morning. She wore a lavender blouse and carried a clipboard filled with forms. No one answered when she knocked. Then the front door creaked open. Silas greeted her with practiced warmth. He apologized for the state of the house, claimed the girls were ill and couldn't come downstairs. He offered tea, but Janet declined. She explained that under state policy she needed to speak directly with the students. Silas tilted his head, then sighed. "Unfortunately, they are in the middle of their monthly silence," he said. "A spiritual tradition." I'm sure you understand, Janet didn't. But before she could insist, The girls appeared at the top of the staircase. They wore pale dresses. Their hair was neatly braided. They stood side by side, unmoving. Eleanor's eyes were downcast. Clara looked straight ahead, her face unreadable. "Girls," Silas called gently, "come say hello to our guest." They descended slowly. Their steps were synchronized. When Janet asked them questions about their studies, their health, their social lives, their answers were short, rehearsed. "We are learning the sacred histories. Father provides all we need. We are safe and fulfilled." Janet scribbled her observations, but it was the way they spoke, not what they said, that unsettled her. Their tone was flat. Their words sounded ceremonial. Before she could press further, Silas stepped in. "I'm afraid we must conclude. The girls must return to prayer." He ushered Janet out with a firm politeness, his hand briefly resting on her shoulder. It wasn't threatening, but it left her cold. She drove back to Topeka in silence. Her official report was cautious. She noted that the girls appeared healthy and clean, but expressed concern about potential over-reliance on spiritual language and limited peer interaction. Her supervisor, Douglas Wilner, read the report, then folded it neatly. "Silas Hartwell is a respected man," he said. "We won't start chasing ghosts." What Janet didn't mention in the official file was what she wrote in her personal notes later that night. Notes she kept locked in a cabinet at home. Their faces were empty, but their hands were trembling. The younger one wanted to speak. Her eyes pleaded for it, but she was drowned out by the silence. "They speak like brides, not daughters." She typed that line, then underlined it 3 times. She never saw the Hartwell sisters again. Decades later, when investigators reopened the case, they would find Janet's notes buried in a forgotten archive of inactive employee files. Her words would become a central point in understanding the true nature of what had happened. Not neglect, not overbearing parenting, but grooming, ceremony, and the transformation of daughters into something far more disturbing. Chapter 7. The Fire and the Silence. It happened on a stifling August night in the summer of 1979. The townspeople of Aldridge were sleeping with their windows open, fans whirring and cicadas humming in the trees. At 2:14 in the morning, the fire alarm at the local station blared to life. Flames had been reported at the old Hartwell estate. By the time the fire trucks arrived, half the west wing was already swallowed in smoke. The rose bushes near the veranda crackled and hissed. An orange glow pulsed from the parlor windows. The ornate roofline, once pristine, was sagging and blackened. Inside, firefighters found Eleanor Hartwell sprawled at the foot of the hallway staircase, unconscious. Her nightgown was singed at the hem. Her hair reeked of smoke and ash. She had no burns on her skin, but her breathing was shallow, and her pulse was faint. She was carried out on a stretcher as the flames licked the walls behind her. Clara Hartwell was nowhere to be found. Silas, clad in a robe and standing barefoot on the lawn, told emergency responders that Clara had run away weeks prior. "She grew disobedient," he said in a distant tone. "It was only a matter of time." No one questioned him. No one asked why there had been no missing person report, no posters, no community search. The fire was deemed electrical, faulty wiring, according to the local inspector. An accident, nothing suspicious. Eleanor regained consciousness at Aldridge Regional Hospital the following afternoon. She said little. She blinked slowly, eyes distant, and muttered fragments of prayers. When a nurse asked about her sister, Eleanor simply whispered, "She ran into the light." By the end of the week, she had disappeared. A nurse recalled that a man claiming to be her uncle signed her out. No ID was checked. No signature was confirmed. The hospital, small and understaffed, let her go without further question. She was never seen again. Silas sold the house within a month. The new buyers, a couple from Wichita, backed out before signing papers. The estate sat empty for years, eventually falling into disrepair. Silas himself vanished. Some said he moved north. Others whispered he had gone to Europe to lecture. But no records of him leaving the country were ever found. The fire marshal filed the final report. No foul play. Accidental origin. Case closed. The town moved on. Aldridge had seen loss before. Farming accidents, tragic drownings, the occasional runaway. But the Hartwell family lingered in the air like smoke. People stopped speaking of the girls altogether. Their names became uncomfortable memories, folded into silence. But inside the scorched walls of that estate, ash-covered relics remained. The mirrors of the prayer chamber were cracked but intact. A melted reel of Silas's voice recorder lay twisted on the floor. The third ring, Clara's, was never recovered. No one searched the woods beyond the estate. No one questioned what had really happened that night. The fire gave them an answer, and the silence gave them an excuse. A town that once ignored the signs now buried the truth, and somewhere out there, Eleanor was alive, or something like her was. Chapter 8. The Box in the Wall. In early spring of 2021, a young couple from Colorado bought the long-abandoned Hartwell estate at auction. They had plans to restore the old Victorian home to its original charm. The listing made no mention of its history. The realtor called it a fixer-upper with character. The neighbors didn't say much either. The couple, Emily and Daniel Baird, were 3 weeks into renovations when Daniel decided to remove the warped bookshelf in the upstairs study. It was nailed to the wall and strangely heavy. As he pried it loose, dust fell in clouds. Behind it, he discovered a thin crack in the plaster and a faint outline of what looked like a sealed panel. Curiosity gave way to unease as the panel opened with a gentle tug. Inside the shallow cavity, nestled in dry insulation, was a small wooden box. It was old, hand-carved, and latched shut with a brass clasp. Emily opened it. Inside were dozens of folded letters, some written in tight cursive, others in frantic scrawl. There was a silver locket, tarnished with age, containing 2 tiny photographs. Eleanor and Clara, maybe 16 and 14. Between them, a pressed flower rested like a funeral keepsake. But what disturbed them most were the cassette tapes. 6 of them, each labeled in red ink, Bride Session Y, Bride Session 2, Emotional Purification, Chastity Rite A, Chastity Rite B, Final Union Rehearsal. They called the police. Within 48 hours, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation had taken custody of the box. The tapes were transferred to a forensic lab for restoration. The audio files they recovered would later be played at conferences, university lectures, and cold case seminars, but for the agents who heard them first, they were unforgettable. Silas Hartwell's voice was calm, melodic. Breathe, Eleanor. Submission is trust. Now repeat. My heart belongs to the Trinity. I am bound by the sacred ring. Your body is the vessel. Your mind is the altar. Another tape featured Clara. She sounded distant, as if reading under duress. Yes, Father. I accept the purification. I will obey. I will obey. I will obey. The audio was clear. There were no screams, no overt violence, but what made it chilling was how gentle Silas's tone remained throughout. Grooming disguised as devotion, control masked as compassion. The letters filled in the gaps. Some were never sent drafts to their grandmother in Ohio, Others were Eleanor's journal entries, copied and hidden. One described the fire. Clara was going to run again. She said she'd light the prayer tapes on fire. I begged her to wait. I don't know if she ever meant to come back. One letter ended with a single question. If we were brides, then where was the wedding? Or were we already buried in it? The case was reopened. News spread fast. By May of 2021, national outlets ran the headline: "The Hartwell Brides, Grooming, Fire, and a Forgotten Cult Inside a Kansas Home." Podcast episodes, documentaries, and survivor advocates picked up the story. The town of Aldridge, long silent, found itself under a microscope. But the investigation had only just begun. And behind the sensationalism, behind the podcasts and police reports, lay a truth that had waited in that wall for over 4 decades. A truth whispered in candlelight, recited in ritual, and sealed in silence. Until now. Chapter 9. Eleanor's Return. Detective Anne Granger had been working cold cases for 16 years. When the Hartwell investigation was reopened in 2021, she expected resistance, dead ends, and a wall of decades-old silence. What she didn't expect was a living witness. A name surfaced through cross-referenced hospital records, property leases, and archived convent rosters. Sister Miriam Eloise had been living in a rural Oregon convent since the early 1980s. She arrived without family, no clear medical history, and a history of trauma too deep for ordinary questions. She had never spoken of her past. Until Anne knocked on the chapel door. The nun who answered said Sister Miriam had known this day would come. She was already sitting in the garden, eyes closed, rosary in hand. She looked up slowly when Anne approached. She was in her 60s now. Gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, deep lines around her mouth. But her eyes were the same. Photographs didn't lie. It was Eleanor Hartwell. "I knew someone would come," she said, barely above a whisper. The interview took place in a quiet room just off the chapel. Anne let the silence settle first. Then she gently slid the silver locket across the table. Eleanor's hands trembled. "She kept that," she said. "Clara." And then she began to speak. She described everything. The ceremonies, the grooming, the prayers, the sacred trinity. She spoke of the veil, the rings, the mirrors, the recordings. Silas, she said, believed he was preserving their mother's spirit through devotion, through them. "But it was never about her," Eleanor whispered. "It was about him, his control, his hunger." She described how Clara fought harder than she ever had, how she ran, resisted, screamed in silence, and then how she snapped. "She started the fire," Eleanor admitted. "She said it was the only way to kill it all. The rules, the rituals. Him." Anne leaned forward. "What happened that night, Eleanor?" Eleanor's voice broke. "She lit the prayer tapes first. Poured kerosene down the hallway. I tried to stop her, not because I disagreed, but because I was afraid. I still thought we could fix it somehow, that we could make it stop without burning it down." Her hands trembled as she reached for the locket. "When the flames started climbing the walls, Clara ran. Out the back door, into the orchard. You didn't follow? I couldn't. I was too slow. The smoke took me. I woke up in the hospital, and then I vanished, just like she did." "Did she survive?" Eleanor shook her head. "I don't know. I never saw her again. But sometimes, I think I hear her. In dreams, or in the wind." Anne pressed further, but Eleanor offered no more. Clara's body had never been found. The woods behind the Hartwell estate were searched again in the following weeks, this time with cadaver dogs and aerial drones. Still nothing. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her. Eleanor was granted immunity in exchange for her full testimony. She remained at the convent, choosing seclusion over the storm of media attention that followed. Her recorded statement became the cornerstone of the Hartwell case's official closure. But something lingered, an ache, a question. Had Clara died that night in fire, or had she escaped into something darker, deeper, untraceable? A shadow walking just beyond the edge of memory. Chapter 10. The Town That Forgot. The obituary was brief. Stephen Mallory, age 78, passed away peacefully in his sleep at his home in rural Idaho. He is survived by no known family. A retired psychologist, he enjoyed reading, gardening, and bird-watching. It ran in a local paper in March of 2001. No one in Aldridge saw it. No one recognized the name. But years later, when authorities cross-referenced archived death records with forensic evidence from the reopened case, they discovered what should have been obvious. Stephen Mallory was Dr. Silas Hartwell. He had fled Kansas in the early 80s, changed his identity with forged war documents, and built a quiet life in the Pacific Northwest. He taught briefly at a community college, lived in a bungalow, never remarried. Neighbors called him gentle and reserved. The monster had outlived his crimes. There would be no trial, no confession. But the court of public record did not forget. His name became synonymous with manipulation disguised as devotion. His tapes were archived and studied by federal investigators. His letters, now digital exhibits, were analyzed in FBI seminars focused on psychological abuse and familial grooming. In Kansas, the town of Aldridge wrestled with its own shame. The Hartwell estate, long abandoned, was torn down. The ground where the house once stood was repurposed as a public green space. Children now played on land that had once witnessed ceremonies no child should ever endure. At the far edge of the park, beneath the shade of a willow tree, the town installed a memorial bench. It was simple. Gray stone. No elaborate inscription. Just two names. Eleanor Hartwell, Clara Hartwell. We remember. Some residents protested. Others asked why it was necessary to remind people of something so dark. But those who had lived through the silence knew better. The bench became a place where people sat in quiet reflection. Sometimes flowers appeared. Once, a woman left a white veil. Another time, someone placed a gold ring on the seat and walked away without a word. In schools, teachers avoided the topic. In church, no one mentioned the name Hartwell. The town moved forward, but never truly healed. Eleanor remained in Oregon, never returning home. She declined in interviews, declined apologies. She said her silence wasn't forgiveness, it was survival. Clara's fate remained a mystery. Her name lived on in missing persons databases, in unsolved case files, in forums that debated what might have happened that night in the orchard. Some believed she died in the fire. Others thought she escaped and chose never to return. But no one ever found her, and perhaps that was the final cruelty. A girl who fought so hard to be seen, remembered only as a shadow. The story of the Hartwell sisters spread far beyond Kansas. It was told in podcasts, true crime documentaries, academic journals. But its deepest power wasn't in the horror of what happened. It was in the way it had gone unnoticed. The rules, the rituals, the whispers behind curtains, all of it had hidden in plain sight. Sometimes, the most horrifying marriages don't involve strangers. They are born inside the family home. sanctioned by silence, protected by trust. The town forgot. But we remember. And if this story disturbed you, if it shook something loose, then let it be a reason to keep watching, to keep asking, and to keep searching. Because the truth hides in places no one wants to look. And that's it for today's story. Make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories that refuse to stay buried.